These workshops are held approximately bi-monthly, and they're primarily virtual at this time. You can stay informed on workshops and our other events by following us on Facebook and Instagram at FedwayWA, or registering for our newsletter. Information for that will be in a follow-up email and also should be on the screen. If Colleen can get to the next slide. There we go. Perfect. You can scan the QR code to get to it. And another great way is to check out our e-newsletter at cityofederalway.com/e-newsletter. We've got a bunch of really cool workshops coming up, and we'll tell you a little bit more about that at the end. But without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mary-Margaret Greene, our speaker. Please hold any questions until the end, at which point you can unmute yourself or pop into the chat, and Pauline will ask a question on your behalf, and also drop questions into the chat during, and then we will hopefully get to them at the Q&A at the end. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to pass it over to Mary-Margaret Greene from UW Botanic Gardens to take us away.
Thank you, Emma, for that introduction. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen so you can see mine. How's that look, Emma? You can give me a thumbs up if you can see it well. Yeah, great. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here, but as we get started, I do want to take a moment to reflect on the land on which I live and on which I work here in the Seattle area. So I'm a little further north from y'all, up in the Seattle area. And I want to acknowledge and honor the Coast Salish peoples of this land and the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. My name is Mary-Margaret Greene, and I'm the Adult Education Program Assistant at the University of Washington Botanic Gardens, if you've been up there. The UW Botanic Gardens is basically making it possible tonight for me to teach this class through the city of Federal Way. So I'd like to extend my thanks to the folks at Federal Way for bringing me and the Botanic Gardens into their class series. It's a great honor. The UW Botanic Gardens mission is sustaining managed and natural ecosystems and the human spirit through plant research, education, and display. Our physical spaces include the Washington Park Arboretum and the Center for Urban Horticulture in Seattle, including the Union Bay Natural Area, Miller Library, UW Student Farm, and the Sarah UW Native Plant Nursery. Through our education programs, outstanding collections, and natural areas, we strive to inspire and enrich the lives of students and the public. And I'm very honored to be connected now to the City of Federal Way to be able to share one of our pretty popular classes. All right, let's go ahead. So I kind of pull my stuff around so I can be the most efficient. Here we go. All right, so as I said, my name is Mary-Margaret. I have a master's of environmental horticulture. I've been teaching environmental horticulture and environmental science for the past decade or so in various positions. And right now, of course, I work for the adult education programs at the University of Washington Botanic Gardens. This is a picture of my baby, who you may hear in the background. He is going through his bedtime right now with my partner. So hopefully he should be settling down, but let's go ahead and dive right into the actual topic of this evening, which is pollinator pathways and some native plants that you can use in your garden. Just to give you an overview about what I'm going to hit tonight, we'll start by defining pollinator pathways, and we'll talk a little bit about pollinator background information, how to create a pollinator targeted patch, and then I'll wrap up with some native plants that you can use that will attract and support pollinator populations. And at the end, I hope to have at least 10 minutes for Q&A, so you can ask me any specific questions. Just to get started, I'm going to ask Colleen to put up my first poll. Which of these best describes you as a student? You can pick one. You're experienced, you feel pretty comfortable with these topics, somewhat experienced, maybe you can garden and maybe you know some native plants, but you're looking to see which ones are best for pollinators. Or maybe you're a beginner, you're pretty new to gardening, pollinators, native plants, but you're game to learn. So see what folks are feeling this evening and give you about a few seconds to think about that one. A couple more seconds for folks to think about that. And then Colleen, can we get the results thrown up so we can kind of see the spread of the class? Awesome. Oh, pretty good spread. A few experienced folks. I like the somewhat experienced. It's like you're on the way to learning. Maybe you want to learn a few more things. I'm hoping to be able to hit something for everybody. People who are just starting to get interested in gardening and planting plants, native plants for pollinators, and those of you that have maybe been gardening for a long time. So that's exciting. It's nice to have a good spread. All right. Just to get started, I want to talk a little bit about what pollinator pathways are. So a lot of times, pollinator pathways are really about connecting big picture spaces that will give pollinators a way to move around and survive. A lot of times we're good at making island oases at city level. So you think like big parks that are managed by cities. In the city of Federal Way, I'm much more familiar with the Seattle area, but you think about these big parks that you're able to plant these spaces, and maybe these pollinators have some habitat there. But each of those islands is fragile, especially if it isn't connected by people's yards, actually providing more of a connection of like food, habitat, that sort of thing. And if we can make paths between the islands, so if my backyard has a few plants that some pollinators can use, and maybe my neighbor like a couple doors down has some of those plants as well, between the two of us, or between a whole linking of people, maybe between two larger sections of land that are bigger parks, we can support populations' ability to move between those larger areas. Even when you're thinking about like one end of the city that's just like on the outskirts and the other end of a city, being able to connect populations across that big space. Pollinators are often quite small. They don't have tons of range. So being able to have like a flow of space that they're able to use, populations will be able to connect. So this concept of where we can support their ability to move between these islands and interbreed and find new places to nest and spread, this concept was started by Sarah Bergman in Seattle back in around 2007 to create paths of resources. And her projects were like big strips of land that she was controlling, like parks. But those are big projects that not a lot of us have the resources or connections to do, but we can do our part by creating a habitat in our own yards and spaces. And if we all do that to some extent, then we are going to be creating a similar thing, a similar connected space for these pollinators to be able to move around in. So when you're thinking about what kinds of plants you want to integrate in your yard, you want to think about what kinds of pollinators you want to attract. So starting thinking about what kinds of pollinators you have, this is a really cute picture of a bat. We don't really have much bat pollination up here, unfortunately. That's more southwest. But we do have bees, bumblebees, and solitary bees. We've got wasps and flies and beetles and butterflies, moths, and of course birds. All of those things are great things to attract to your yard. If you want to attract a certain type of them, you can actually sort of cherry pick what kinds of plants you put in your yard. So think about what kinds of pollinators you're interested in attracting. And then you can kind of pick the plants that you want to be able to cater to those groups. I'm a big fan of trying to attract all of them, but that's just me. If you're looking for just the bees, we got plants for that. And then just a quick note, this is a 2012 National Pollinator Week poster that was like the US Fish and Wildlife Service. I was working for them at the time. It's a bit of nostalgia for me, this kind of busy poster, but it does kind of highlight what's really pollinators are really important to us, not just from a oh, they pollinate our, our native plants and things. A third of our food crops are pollinated by just bees. Bees, solitary bees mostly, but also bumblebees. There's only 47 bumblebee species in North America, but worldwide there's 20,000 known bee species, and they do a big service in pollinating our food crops. And this is just an image of a lot of the plants that do rely on bee pollination just to be able to produce the food that we have. So using native plants to support those diverse pollinator populations, and some of these as well, these crops that you're seeing like tomatoes and eggplants, These are best pollinated by native bees or bumblebees. They're not as effectively pollinated by honeybees, for example. So by using native plants to support these more diverse pollinator populations, it does mean that we're creating a stronger food supply system, because we're creating this space for these pollinators to be able to thrive even when those crops aren't around. They're very seasonal. If we can have these native plants to help support their populations in these off seasons for our food plants, it can really contribute to a stronger food system as well. And then, of course, like I said, honeybees can be great. We can have honeybees, but bumblebees and native bees are best suited to pollinating flowers like tomatoes and blueberries. They use something called buzz pollination, where they crawl up in there and they vibrate, which honeybees can't do. They shake the pollen out of the flower, and it's a very cool process. I highly encourage you to look up a YouTube video of it. Just look up buzz pollination. So supporting those native bumblebee populations can really be do a big help to these sorts of plants as well. So we get something out of the arrangement as well as the native plants. So some challenges that pollinators face that kind of should encourage you to go out and try to provide more habitat for them. The main thing is actually urbanization. Like I was saying, we're creating these islands for them to be able to visit and get food and shelter. They're in those tiny islands of those small oases because we've paved over a lot of things. We've removed a lot of meadows, we've removed a lot of places where they used to be able to forage. So urbanization is a really big thing that we can fight against by trying to make whatever green space we have, whether it's a window box or a yard or a larger property, trying to make that a friendly place for them to be able to visit and live in. Pesticide and herbicide use are another really big challenge for them. Obviously, those two things can really be detrimental to their populations. A lot of the pesticides that we use are very general. So you might think that you're getting rid of a pest and maybe it works, but you're also probably damaging the local beneficial insect populations as well. So reducing those kinds of things can help. Predation, got a great photo that my mother took of a bee getting taken down by a spider. But other predators that they may not normally face because we have a changing climate. Climate change is another thing as well. Disease and competition from non-native pollinators. Excuse me. And then predation from non-native insects as well. Again, inhaled a cat hair, excuse me. All right, so what can we provide to help them sort of fight against those challenges that they face, those everyday challenges? Obviously, the thing we're talking tonight mostly about is food, right? We can plant a variety of things that bloom at a wide range of times so that they have something to be able to eat throughout the season. Shelter is also super important. Trees, shrubs, so things that you don't normally think of as really good pollinator plants because you're like, oh, their blooms aren't really interesting to them, or maybe it doesn't bloom very often, or it doesn't have a lot of blooms. Sometimes having really shrubby areas, especially for birds, can be really good to provide shelter. Piles of wood, bare dirt, a lot of those solitary bees, bumblebees, and other types of insects, they actually make their nests by burrowing into loose dirt or into gravel. I had a bumblebee nest in a pile of gravel last summer that I was like, oh, I guess I'll just leave that gravel pile for the season until they're done. And they were just buzzing in and out. You could watch them go into their little tunnel. So check out those spaces in your yard. Piles of bricks as well. If you leave out a pile of bricks, they like to nest in there. So you can kind of actually try to make your yard an attractive, mine was just a pile of gravel, but you could probably, go in there and actually design these spaces for these different types of pollinators to be able to inhabit. Reliability over time is another really big thing as well. So insects that rely on pollen and nectar, they usually only live for a single season, right? They come out in the spring, sometimes from hibernation, and then they make it through the fall, and then that population crashes at the end, and maybe the queen bee goes and hibernates for the winter. So through that space, they really need to have a really good supply of food and habitat. And every year that we're able to provide more of that means that we're able to support a more stable population. So the longer time you're able to do that, the more of those insects are going to be able to survive year to year. And then finally, bounty and efficiency. Design your yard to have everything. Be a supermarket for these animals, for these pollinators. So they don't have to travel very far. If you plant a bunch of different things, you have a ton of, make sure you plant a lot of stuff, and you have a lot of space for them to be able to make homes. They can just hang out in your yard and maybe visit some other places as well. But if you make your yard a really good place for them to visit, it's efficient. They know that they can hang out and find a lot of what they need in a small space. And that can be really beneficial to them as well. Insect foraging ranges from like a few hundred meters to about 3 miles. So keep that in mind. These insects don't go very far. They're really just hanging out in your neighborhood. So the more you can provide, the more you're able to know that they're they're only hanging out right there and they can get everything they need. So to design a native pollinator patch, so you're thinking about your native plants, you want to keep in mind both of those pollinator needs and the challenges that we talked about before. Incorporate shelter in your garden. You can have like a nurse log that you have in your yard, or you can create a rock garden as well that you have plants planted in around there. Create a variety of flower colors and shapes. So as we'll talk a little bit more about, different flower shapes and colors attract different types of pollinators. I've got a little bit, we'll talk about each of these plants tonight, each of these 4 plants, but you can see the variety of different shapes and colors that are happening here. Each of those different shapes and colors will attract different types of pollinators. So for example, bees and wasps really like white, yellow, and blue flowers. Beetles really like green and white flowers. Flies really like pale white, dull colors. Butterflies are really into like bright colors, reds and purples. And then thinking of like hummingbirds really love red flowering currant, which is that picture in the upper left of the 4, this one right here. They love those tubular, bright colored flowers, love them. So think about which of those flowers like appeals to you, and you can think about like what kinds of insects you want to, or pollinators you want to attract. Plant a lot. If you have space, don't just plant like one bush or one plant, right? If you plant a group of them, then it's going to be a much more efficient stop for these pollinators. They can come by, they can visit a bunch of of your patch. If you have a larger patch of something, it's going to lengthen the flowering time. A single red flowering currant bush, for example, will flower, but if you have like 3 bushes next to each other or 3 bushes throughout your yard, they're going to bloom at slightly different times. And so that will lengthen the different times it'll lengthen the period of time that these insects can come and visit and get benefit from those flowers. Try to plant flowers for year round. Install plants that, you like, these plants are going to bloom in the very earliest part of spring. And then these plants are going to start blooming right after that. And then these plants are going to start blooming right after that. Really pay attention to bloom times and see if you can create a little calendar for yourself to make sure that, okay, for these 3 months, this is probably going to be blooming. And for these 3 months, this is going to be blooming. The more you have a continuous supply of these plants that are available as food sources, the happier your insect and pollinator populations are going to be. And then again, I want to emphasize reducing pesticide and herbicide use and talk a little bit more about that. So reducing pesticide and herbicide use can be pretty tough for some people. It's like a really easy thing to do, right? You're like, I really don't want this pest. I'm having a problem with this pest, or these weeds are really trying to getting up in my yard. Reducing these chemicals can really help the pollinator populations. And the first thing I like to suggest to people to try to reduce their pesticide and herbicide use is actually choose the right plant for the right place. One of the biggest troubles people end up having with plants is that a plant is planted somewhere that it's just not going to thrive. That plant has been planted in the shade and it actually needs full sun. A plant that's struggling for sunlight that it really desperately needs is going to be so much more susceptible to disease or pests. So really take time to make sure that you're choosing plants that fit the right places. If you've got a really wet spot in your yard, plant a plant that's going to be okay with having its feet wet. If you have a really high and dry hot spot, make sure you're planting a plant that fits that location. That is like half the battle for any of these issues that you run into. The happier a plant is in its location, the much tougher it's going to be when it does face things like fighting off pests and also competing with weeds. I've got a disease triangle over here on the right side of the screen. So thinking about like what causes disease, first you need a host plant. Of course, I really want you to plant these host plants. You should plant plants in your yard. And then you have your disease, biotic disease or abiotic disease, and then there's the environment. You can choose your host plant and you can choose the environment. Make sure that those things match up as well as they can so that they're not providing a really great spot for the disease to be able to introduce itself. So again, right plant, right place. Sometimes you can get plants that are bred that are like a little more resistant to a really common disease. Asking somebody at the nursery that you're getting your plants from, they'll know if there's anything that they can do to help you to pick out the right plant. Take care of your soil. Beneficial fungi are a really huge part of plant success. So if you like amend your soil and you dig it in, make sure that taking care of taking care of your soil will mean that your plants are going to be much happier. So digging in those kinds of things before you plant your plants, like compost and covering them up with mulch, that can be a really big help as well. Monitor your plants to catch these issues early. So I really am a big proponent of using yellow sticky cards. They're really common in nurseries, and I use them in my backyard as well. Yellow sticky cards are basically just little fly traps that attract little insects, and you can kind of take a look like, oh, I have a lot of like fungus gnats. Maybe I need to stop overwatering over here. And then checking on your plants, like giving a visual check on the leaves whenever you water, whenever you need to go check on them. It's really good, a good habit to be in, to just kind of check. The earlier you find things, the more likely you'll be able to be like to manually treat something, spraying off aphids or something like that. Those are totally viable ways of doing that. All of these methods are basically catch it early and prevention, which is the best way to reduce pesticide and herbicide use. Right now is a good time to be weeding, like right now when it's all rainy and miserable, because the weeds are starting to come up. You know, like now is a good time to catch those weeds and dig them up by hand, because they're small. I struggle constantly with bindweed in my backyard, and really the only way I can keep on top of it is to dig it out now, because it's going to grow a lot over the season. So early intervention is going to be the best bet there for reducing your pesticide and herbicide use. I'll give a quick shout out to natural pesticides, but know that they're not necessarily safer. Natural pesticides or organic pesticides, they're just designed to break down faster because they're made from organic materials. But you should still practice the best methods of safety if you decide to use them. All right, shelter. So shelter is another great thing that you can provide for insects rather than just plants. 70% of our native bees are ground nesting. They like to create burrows in the soil. So they need access to bare soil, and they might be impacted by tilling of the soil. So leaving some leaf litter at the base of your plants, or leaving a little pile of brush, as you can see in these photos, those are great ways to be able to provide some of our native bees some habitat for them to be able to nest. 30% of native bees are cavity nesting, such as leafcutter and mason bees. And those species need cavities in dead wood, hollow stems. You can see these like the bamboo pieces on the far left of this slide. And you can totally provide like those bee houses that you can, so like those commercial bee hotels, you'll see like the bamboo image, or like a little something that's marketed as a bee house. Those are great things to have in your yard. Do be aware that you do need to change them out every couple of years, just to reduce buildup of disease and mites for the bees, because all those insects that like to feed on baby bee larvae will build up over a while. So just like you're rotating crops of tomatoes to like new beds to reduce disease buildup in the soil, you want to make sure that you're changing out those bee houses pretty regularly as well, so that those diseases don't build up for the bee populations. All right, here's my next poll. If Colleen would throw this up for me. Do you already have any native plants growing in your yard or your property? Give people a few seconds to think about that. Couple more seconds. Awesome. Thanks, Colleen. Awesome. So a lot of you already have some native plants growing in your yard or property. You might learn something new about them tonight, or you might learn about a new native plants. If you don't have any native plants in your yard, they're actually quite easy to find, to purchase, or even to grow yourself from seed. And those of you that aren't sure, maybe you'll be able to learn some of the plants that you might have in your yard. All right. Another poll before we dive into some of the actual native plants. And are you already specifically growing those native plants, native or not, actually, to support pollinators? So are you already thinking about pollinators in your plantings? Give people a few more seconds. Awesome. So a lot of you are already thinking about pollinators in your yard. That's great. As I said, the more we plant plants to support pollinators, the more we're able to support our backyard gardens as well. So attracting those pollinators can be really great for if you do any backyard gardening, like vegetable plantings or fruit trees. All right, let's go ahead and dive into my favorite part of the evening, which is the actual native plants that are great at supporting pollinators. I really love this plant. Many of you might be familiar with it. It's very popular around here. This is red flowering currant, Raibi sanguinium. This is going to attract hummingbirds, butterflies, bees, those beautiful they're quite tiny flowers, actually. Those racemes of flowers are very beautiful, but the flowers themselves are quite small, and they attract those creatures that can get, their tongues or their beaks down into the neck of the flower. So one of the great things about red flowering currant is that it blooms very early, and it actually blooms before the leaves come out on the plant. It blooms starting in February in warm years. I feel like I started seeing these blooming more in March this year, actually. I feel like we've had a few cold snaps that have maybe delayed the blooms, but they're still going a little bit. I've started to see them fade. By April, they tend to pretty much fade out, and then there's just the leaves. So it does have that really nice early bloom time that can really kickstart pollinators that need food early in the season. So any of those bees that are emerging out of hibernation can hit these flowers up very early. I will say it can get quite big. It can get 3 to 10 feet tall, depending on where you end up putting it. It really likes full sun or mostly sunny conditions. That's going to make it produce the most flowers. So the more sun it gets, the happier it's going to look with the more blooms that it'll produce. And it likes dry soil. This is not a plant you want to plant at a low sunny spot where water is collecting. It likes to have its feet dry. So I like to see these kind of like planted on a very gentle top of a slope where the water is going to run by and not collect. So it likes that nice dry soil. And again, really great plant. It is a multi-stemmed shrub, so it can get not only like 3 to 10 feet tall, it can get like 5 feet wide. So think of this as like a really good big space filler that's going to be covered in beautiful flowers as well. It does respond pretty well to pruning if you are willing to be able to maintain it with pruning. So if you want to put it in a smaller space, it can be kept back into a smaller space, but it will require maintenance. Skunk cabbage is one that I like to put right after that because it's also an early bloomer and it likes wet, low spots as opposed to the Raibi sanguinium. So this is going to attract flies and beetles, actually. It has a distinctive smell. Some people really like it, some people really don't. It does smell skunky. And you can see those like lantern-like flowers that are like lilies. And it does bloom quite early, March to June. So it has like kind of a long bloom time as well. Really strong scent. It does not get 10 feet tall, but it does get 3 to 5 feet tall and 3 to 5 feet wide. So growth requirements for this is going to be partial shade. So it's going to prefer like some shady kind of low wet spaces. It can also tolerate full shade. I've seen these growing really nicely under like groves of red western cedars in really low wet spaces. So they can be really happy there. They're really good at growing along spaces that just never dry out. If you're living near like kind of a muddy area, these can be really happy plants to fill that space in the spring. And they do support those flies and beetles, which can provide lots of other services as well to your garden. Let's see. I think the fruits, I don't have a picture of the fruits here, but they are quite fun. Later, once the yellow part of the flower dies off, there's like a center cob that looks like a little cob of corn, but it's like got like green to reddish berry-like fruit studded all over it. And it's a pretty fun little thing to see on your plants. All right, Kinnikinnick is our next plant, or Arctostaphos uva ursi. By the way, I'm also including the Latin names because it's much easier to find plants by their Latin names that you know for sure it's the native variety. So when you go into a nursery, a lot of times these plants look very similar to other things that we have that are ornamentals that aren't native. If you have the Latin name at hand, you'll be able to check and make sure it's the native version that you're getting. So that's just for your reference. Don't feel like you have to memorize the Latin name. So Kinnikinnick is a really lovely little plant. It's going to attract bees, some butterflies, and hummingbirds. It has these really nice, it's in the family that's related to like blueberries and things like that. So they all have this urn-shaped hanging flower that you can see in this photo that has like, pollinators need to be able to have long tongues and beaks to be able to get up into the flowers to get the nectar and pollen. It blooms fairly early, a little bit minor blooming right now, actually March through April. I feel like they last a little bit all the way through May, actually, is where I'd peg them. It's also a very short plant. So if you're looking for something that's going to be short and it spreads, this is perfect. Grows less than a foot tall. It spreads, but not aggressively. It's like a very slow, low growing, creeping shrub. I will say it is best in full sun or mostly sunny conditions with soil that's pretty well drained. One of the best places I see this thriving, especially in cities, is actually right next to a curb. So if you're looking to replace like a strip of curb that you have between like your sidewalk and the curb where you park your car on the street, this is a really good plant to put there instead of grass. It provides flowers for things, and it also fills that space out really nicely. So you can put a few plugs of this and it will fill out over the course of a few years. Really nice spreading little shrub. That actually fights grass off pretty well. So once you kind of like weed it and make sure it's really well established, it's a happy camper. So really nice plant for those spaces that then provides pollinator services. All right, we have tall Oregon grape. I'll talk about low Oregon grape next. So this is Berborous Aquifolium or Mahonia aquifolium. There's some differences based on who's labeling it, but this is our native Oregon grape that's tall. So this is going to attract bees, butterflies, moths, and hummingbirds. This is not a picture of it in flower. This is a picture of it while it's fruiting. The fruits do attract other birds as well. So if you're looking to get a double whammy of like the flowers are really attracted to pollinators, these fruits, birds love them. Nice dusky grape looking fruits. The flowers are like highlighter yellow. So they can be really funny, like highlighter yellow frothy groups of flowers. This is going to be a spring bloomer, not nearly as early as the other ones. I feel like they're starting now. You'll see them blooming starting late March, early April, and then they last all the way through June actually. So if you plant a stand of these, they have like a nice long blooming time. They do get pretty tall, up to 7 feet tall, and they can be multi-stemmed, so they're a dense shrub. But if you're looking for a plant that can also provide like habitat for birds and have shrubby space for these animals to hide in as well, it's a really good plant. It's going to prefer sunny to partial shade, and more sunny on the sunny end. So think of it on the edge of somewhere where it's shady. It's a good transitional plant with well-drained soil. And this is also a very tough plant. It can survive in really low nutrient soils. I think this is a really good parking lot plant. Not that a lot of you will have access to like choosing what plants grow in a parking lot, but this is a really good native plant for planting places that it's just kind of like nothing else is gonna do super well here. It's dry, it's like maybe it's got a lot of runoff from the street here. This is a really tough plant. All right, and we'll talk about its close relative, dull Oregon grape, also known as low Oregon grape, because it is short. So it only grows up to 3 feet tall. So if you're looking for a much shorter, smaller plant that has the exact same flowers and the exact same fruit, this will be your friend. This is Berberis Nervosa or Mahonia nervosa. It attracts all the same things: bees, butterflies, moths, hummingbirds, with those bright highlighter yellow flowers. You can kind of see in this photo some early flowers coming out in the middle of the plant. It has a similar bloom time, March through June. I feel like they usually bloom a little bit later than the tall Oregon grape, but they do bloom for about the same time. Like I said, it's much smaller, only 3 feet tall. It likes dry soil, but as opposed to the tall Oregon grape, this is going to be much happier in the shade, full shade to mostly shady. So if you have like some trees growing in your backyard, like Douglas firs, things like that, this is a good plant to kind of grow at their feet. It will do pretty well in nice full shade like that. All right, we have some vine maple. This is one of my favorite ones, Acer sosinatum. I will say any maple that you end up planting is really good for bees. Bees really love maples. They bloom really early. They start blooming in March and June, and also their flowers are really high in protein, the pollen is, and so bees really love these. This is going to grow 10 to 26 feet tall, so definitely something that you want space for, but it's on the smaller end of a tree. It's going to grow best in shade or partial shade with really moist soil. You want this plant to not be anywhere that's going to get really high and dry. It grows as a pretty open branch. It's a very graceful small tree, so I always encourage people to take a look at this one. I think it looks very like elegant. Something to keep in mind as well, if you're interested, is that vine maples have great fall color. And the more sunny end that you put them in, they turn like a really beautiful fire engine red in the fall. And then the shadier places, they're going to have a little more muted colors, a little more yellow orange. But you can kind of play with that depending on how much sunlight you're putting them in with their different fall colors. All right, Western Azalea. So this is Rhododendron occidentale. This one I have heard can be a bit of a challenge to grow, so do keep that in mind. I don't have this one in my yard. This is going to attract bees and hummingbirds and butterflies. Really lovely photos, very lovely flowers. I mean, very lovely photos of the flowers. It's going to bloom a little bit later, late spring to early summer. Very fragrant flowers, very noticeably sweet smelling. It can get 10 to 15 feet tall, but it does respond really well to trimming and pruning, so you can keep it the size that you want. It's going to be happiest in sunny areas with moist soil, and it's a very dense shrub, so it's going to provide some pretty good habitat for birds as well. I will say that azaleas are toxic to people and pets. So if you have a dog that likes to chew on things when they go out in the backyard, this is not a good choice. And if you are a beekeeper, I think I have read that it's not the best thing to have near your bees, because the toxin can actually seep into the honey as well. So keep that in mind, but very beautiful plant if you don't have those constraints. All right, Osoberry, which I feel like goes really nicely actually with vine maple. This is Alleria Sarasiformis. It attracts hummingbirds, bees, butterflies, moths, flies, whole big range of things. It's a small shrubby tree. You can kind of see in the top picture how it kind of grows. It's very open, very lacy, airy plant, somewhere between a tree and a shrub, definitely an understory plant. Grows up to 20 feet tall, but I've seen it usually, I would say, around 15 feet. It does have really beautiful bright green leaves that taste like cucumber, smell like cucumber if you bite into them. And those small clusters of white flowers that you see in that bottom right photo, those actually bloom first before the leaves come out. So there's a time in the early spring, like in February when it starts blooming, where you just see these white flowers dangling from this tree that doesn't have any leaves yet. I think it's the best early sign of spring when you're looking around at native plantings. This is going to be happiest in really shady, moist areas, understory, really rich, nutrient-rich, well-drained, but like moist soil. So a happy plant in those conditions. All right, red osier dogwood. I love this plant. I think it caters to some things that we don't normally think of, like flies, wasps, as well as those butterflies and bees that we often are thinking of when we're thinking about pollinators. The white fruits that form later also attract birds as well. So if you're looking for that, that double treat again of having the pollinators and then feeding the birds. These bloom May to June, so really good late spring, early summer plant. This is also a shrub that responds really well to trimming, but it can get quite large. So keep that in mind. It has these beautiful bright red branches, red osier dogwood, but it can get 3 to like 10 feet tall and also has a pretty big width as well. So those bright red canes though are really, really lovely. Partial shade to like maybe some like more closer to full sun as well. It likes moist and well-drained soil. That's going to be its ideal growth habit. All right, goat's beard, Arronkiss dioicus. I actually just planted one of these. So this is a really nice plant. It attracts butterflies, bees, hoverflies, beetles with those like feathery white flowers. It's going to bloom further into the summer, May through July. Smaller shrub, 3 to 5 feet tall. And it does like that partial shade with moist, rich soil. But it does have those really, really lovely little feathery groups of flowers that you can see in the photos. A little more manageable size than a couple of the previous shrubs that I've talked about. All right, we also have Snowberry. I also just planted one of these. So this is Symphora Carpus albus. Again, we have these kind of like urn-shaped flowers. Those are going to attract bees, hummingbirds, things that can get their tongues and their beaks into the flower base for the pollen and the nectar. So these are going to bloom May through August throughout the summer. And then they do create some really nice, like pretty white fruits that look like little clusters of like plump white berries that will stay on throughout the winter. So after the leaves fall off, the snowberries actually stay on the plant and they're very decorative just that way. I will say they are mildly poisonous, give you a stomachache kind of poisonous, but really nice little fruits that stay on there. And then the birds love those as well. This is going to be a smaller shrub, 3 to 6 feet tall. If it's more in the sun, it's going to stay on the smaller side because it's not stretching for the sunlight. So if you put it more in the like shade, so in that partial sun, partial shade range, which is where it's happiest, the more sun it is, like the smaller it's going to stay, and then the less sun, it's going to be stretching a little bit more for that sunlight. It'll get a little bit bigger. It does like moist to dry soil, so it has a pretty wide range of what it'll tolerate. And I will say it can take over a little bit. It reseeds and spreads pretty easily from the fruit. So bear in mind, like either fill up the space around it with stuff that can, grow up around it and, compete with it, or be prepared for it to kind of fill out a space. If it's just by itself in a nice little spot of soil, it will fill that space over time. All right, this is twinberry, Lonicera involucrata. Going to attract bees, hummingbirds with those nice long-necked flowers. Blooms more in the summer, June, July. And it's actually I don't know why it says less than a foot tall. That's a typo on my part. This is going to get a little bit bigger. This is a shrub that's going to get like, 3 to 8 feet tall. And then again, that wide. It's going to prefer the full sun or mostly sunny conditions. This is in the it's got like very tall, open branched like shape to it. The stems are really slim and pithy. It is in the honeysuckle family. That's what I was stretching for. So this is kind of a local native honeysuckle kind of plant. And it's very tolerant. It grows in full sun or mostly sunny conditions, or even a little bit of partial shade. It does like plenty of moisture, but it will be a plant that makes hummingbirds very happy. And then those berries will attract other birds as well later. All right, here we've got Western wild ginger. One of my favorite weird little flowers, actually, because it's going to attract beetles, flies, ants, because they're flowers that bloom right on the ground underneath the like short little canopy of leaves, those heart-shaped leaves. This is a ground cover. It's not going to grow more than a foot tall. It can grow like a very beautiful carpet of these bright, dark green heart-shaped leaves. Very lovely. And it can like fill a really nice space underneath the shady area. This is going to like full shade, deep shade. With the most moist, most organic soil. Think kind of old growth conditions. So if you've got like a really deep shady spot in your yard that you're going to like mulch and take care of the soil, this is a really good plant that can really thrive here. And as a bonus, it's evergreen. Those leaves are going to stick around year round. So it provides like a nice green part to your yard. Those weird 3-pronged flowers are maroon. You don't normally see them unless you get down on your knees and you kind of look underneath those heart-shaped leaves. But they are very cool, and they do attract beetles and other flies and ants and provide pollination or provide food and things for those creatures. So kind of a fun, different one to include in your yard. All right, here we have bush Pit Simmons. So this is going to be like if you have like some really sunny, well-drained, maybe like a rocky area. This is a really good plant that does really well in Eastern Washington too. So this is going to attract bees, hummingbirds, butterflies. It blooms throughout the summer. It's very short. It like sprawls pretty widely, like very gracefully like spreads throughout an area, but not like aggressively. And again, it likes that full sun. And it's pretty easy to take care of as well. All right, we've got slender cinquefoil as well, another plant that does pretty well in full sun, dry spaces. It's going to bloom throughout the summer as well, June through July. Pretty short, 1 to 2.5 feet. Mostly those flower stems are giving it the most height. Totally shade intolerant. Don't plant this in shade, full sun only. But it does prefer moist soil, but it is moderately drought tolerant. So it can do pretty well in spaces that kind of fluctuate on whether or not there's water or it's really dry. It does easily reseed. So if you want it to spread and fill a space, it will do pretty well doing that as well. All right, we also have wood sorrel, Oxalis oregana, really good coastal plant. It's going to attract bees, hoverflies, which are really nice. Hoverflies are great because their larvae actually will eat pests. So really nice thing to attract to your yard. Bees, hoverflies, butterflies. It does have a really long blooming time. It's never like a ton of flowers at once, but if you have a little crop of these growing in a space, those flowers actually will like bloom over time for like several months, all summer long, April through September. It is a ground cover plant, stays pretty short, foot tall. This is another deep shade plant. Its leaves will fold up if they get exposed to too much sun, and they're like, stop, it's too bright. And if it is in too much sun, it will cook. So not a happy plant in the sun. It does spread through rhizomes though. So do keep in mind that if you don't want it to entirely fill a space, make sure you're planting it along with things that can compete with it. It's not terrible to dig up, but it can be a management thing to keep in mind. All right, here we have some common yarrow. I feel like this plant gets overlooked because people think it looks really weedy, but I really like it. A weed that you can plant on purpose. So this is Achillea Millifolium. It's kind of like a plant that we think of that's like really good for meadows, but we can use it in a lot of spaces because it is a very tough little plant. It likes full sun to mostly sunny conditions. It likes moist to dry soil. It does well in poor soil if it's like right next to your driveway or right next to a sidewalk. Those kind of cruddy soil conditions. It does pretty well in those spaces. So it's a nice little native flowering plant. you can see it forms that nice little umbel, that flat space for butterflies, hoverflies to actually land on and then visit a lot of those teeny tiny little flowers. Kind of see a fly in the bottom right corner visiting those flowers. It blooms later too, so it's blooming April through October, later in the year. So it's providing late season food. It has those nice white, sometimes pinkish flowers. It grows up to 3 feet tall, but really that's just the like umbel that's getting that tall, the flower that's getting really tall. The basal leaves at the bottom are not getting that tall. Usually the whole plant is going to be under 6 feet tall. Again, this is something that hoverflies like, and hoverflies, their larvae really like to eat aphids. So again, incorporating these into your yard can mean that those are helping with any aphid problems you might have. All right, fireweed and actually the next plant, which is Canada goldenrod, I feel like go together. These are two plants that do really well in big areas that you just really don't want to do much maintenance with. So fireweed is going to be really good for bees, hummingbirds, and grows really best in full sun or mostly sunny conditions with well-drained soil. This is a good ditch plant, is what I like to call it. This is something that can fill a ditch with like some really nice flowering things that will provide some beauty, but also die back in the winter. You can like hack them all down and they'll just come back in the spring. They bloom June through September, so a little bit later in the summer as well. And then the seed pods are really fun. When they dry up, you can flick them and they kind of explode and the seeds go everywhere. So really fun little plant to have in spaces that you're okay with it filling a space that's like, you don't really want to plant anything else here. This is an easy native to put there. Alongside that, similarly, also a good ditch plant is Canada goldenrod. This attracts bees, butterflies, beetles, wasps, also kind of late summer, early fall bloomer. It's going to get 1 to 5 feet tall, just like the fireweed. And again, grows best in those full sun or mostly sunny conditions, moist to dry soil, fairly low maintenance. You don't want them right next to a sidewalk because they will like flop over as they age. But if you have them in that like ditch space, or if you have like an edge space in the back of your yard that you just don't, you don't want to just grow grass or something, this is a really good plant to have in those edge spaces. Of course, I can't cover every native plant that's great for pollinators, but there's a few honorable mentions I'd like to put up here before I wrap up. So vaccinium species, so huckleberries, things that are related to blueberries. Vaccinium ovatum and parviflorum do really well in our low elevations. So those are going to be ones that you want to go for. And also vaccinium, the evergreen huckleberry does really well in this space as well. There's manzanitas, native manzanitas that you can use, Arctostaphos columbiana, salal and salmonberry. Sorry, get my cat out of the way. And then white bark raspberry and Saskatoon serviceberry. All of these are really great plants to incorporate as well, that we just simply don't have time to cover all of them tonight. And then I do want to say, you don't have to just plant native plants. There's plenty of non-native plants that native pollinator species absolutely love. If you've been around in the Northwest, you've probably seen a lavender bush that is absolutely buzzing with bumblebees and other types of pollinators as well. I encourage you to plant those as well. However, many native pollinators have co-evolved with native plants. So native plants are providing food that these insects or these birds have been relying on for a long time. Obviously, a really common example of that is like monarch butterflies and milkweed. They simply can't exist without each other. Monarch butterflies need milkweed to be able to like lay their eggs in. But choosing those plants that are going to provide the habitat these pollinators are used to can really create a much more sustainable like system that you're supporting. Native plant species are also often easier to care for and easier to maintain, just because they're used to our local climate. As global warming does come on, think about like which ones are tougher. They're able to withstand those heat swings. But a lot of our native plants are really well adjusted to living through drought-like summers, because that's what it's always been around here, at least in recent history. Like I said, there are plenty of great non-native plants out there that pollinators love. Lavender, heathers, there's witch hazel that blooms really, really early in the winter. All of those plants are great and do great here in the Pacific Northwest, but you can really improve the diversity of your yard with these native plants. All right, so last poll of the evening. I'm coming right up against the time, but I'm happy to stay on a few minutes for some questions if we have time for it. But here's my last poll. How likely are you to search out at least one of these plants and incorporate it into your property? Hopefully there was at least one plant for everyone to be like, oh, that one was new, or I hadn't thought about putting that plant in my yard. A couple more seconds. Awesome. I'm so glad that a lot of you have found something to plant. I used a ton of resources to put this together, and these are all resources that I encourage you to reach out to. Sarah Bergman, the creator of the Pollinator Pathway idea back in 2007, she has a pollinator toolkit. The King County's landscape plans are great, a great resource to check out. They even have planting plans of what does really well next to each other. So I highly encourage you check out those. The Washington Native Plant Society and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service also have some really great pollinator and plant information. Yeah, I have this as a resource for folks to be able to look at the plant list, all the plants that I talked about, their flowering times. Emma and Colleen can send those out to you after this class. And then also that's the list of resources and the links that you can find those resources at. This is a great regional guide. It's in that list of resources. And these are a couple of my favorite insect books to be able to read if you're the kind of person that wants to read a book that's kind of like laid back and fun, but also has a lot of really good information. I highly recommend these as something to learn a lot about pollinators. All right, we have come up right up against 7:01, but I'm happy to hang around for a few minutes, Emma and Colleen, if you are to answer a few questions.
Yeah, so we're going to share just a couple pieces of information real quick, and then we'll stay on a little bit late for some questions. So thank you all for coming, and thank you, Mary-Margaret, for speaking with us today. Colleen, if you could share your screen with the information on the stuff, we can just let you know. We do have some little seed packets. If you're already like raring to go, ready to get started, we have a seed packet with a blend of native flowers that is available for free for all of y'all if you would like to pick it up at the Federal Way City Hall Monday through Friday between 8 and 5. We'll send the details of the address and all of that in the follow-up email, so you don't have to try and scribble that all down right now. But we'll have that available for all through next week for you guys to come and pick it up if you're ready to get started. And if you want to go to the next slide, Colleen, you can again stay up to date with us on all of our different workshops on our social media and our newsletter. And we just wanted to share a couple of upcoming events with you. Also, we're going to have one called Shady Business, which is a natural yard care workshop on like how to have a lush look without a high water bill, where to plant your trees, take the most of shade, moss lawns and lawn alternatives, alternatives to fertilizers and pesticides, sort of touching on some of the same stuff that Mary-Margaret talked about. And that's on Wednesday, May 4th at the same time, 6 p.m. And you can also save the date for our next workshop, which is going to be a green DIY class where you can learn some sort of easy green home improvement that will be coming up on Tuesday, May 24th. So all of those details, again, will be sent out plus a handout and the recording of the workshop. It'll be sent to the email that you registered with. I think, Colleen, we have one last little poll that you can launch that just asks a couple of questions about your experience and topics that you're interested in. We're always happy to hear from you. And then I will turn it back over to Mary-Margaret if there are any questions that folks would like to ask. I know we're going a little over, but so you're welcome to head out if you got to go, but if you can stay for a few extra minutes and you have some questions, now is the time. Go ahead and unmute yourself if you would like, or drop them in the chat and we'll ask them on your behalf.
See, I can actually see one in the chat right now that says if I could suggest which ones do pretty good in containers for those of you that are, maybe you have a balcony or you live in an apartment. Great question. I would say that any of the plants that are of the smaller shrub variety or the herb variety. So thinking of like the yarrow or the wood sorrel or the slender cinquefoil, the bush penstemon, those are all going to be plants that do pretty well in containers. If you get a great big container, I have grown ossoberry in a big container for a long time. I did finally plant it out into the yard when I finally had a yard space. But you can do those like shrub trees in a container if you're willing to get kind of a big, I would say like 3-foot wide container to put those in. And you have like an outdoor like deck or something to be able to put it on. But yeah, great question.
There's another question in the chat from David. I'm looking to start an herb and tea garden, mostly perennials. Any suggestion for shade pollinators? Shadow covers a quarter of the garden.
Yeah, a lot of herbs are full sun plants, I will say. A lot of those things that we think of as like fitting into the herb and tea group do really prefer full sun. Let's see. Yeah, mostly perennials too. Yeah, I'm kind of drawing like that's more of a, also my expertise truly is in like native plants and restoration plants. So thinking of like food plants like that is more of an ornamental and like food plant question. I will say most of those plants are going to be full sun plants. But you can often go into a nursery and talk to someone and be like, hey, I'm looking for something that fits these requirements, and they know everything in their stock and they can answer all of those questions. One of the nurseries I really like in the area is called Go Natives Nursery. They have a ton of native plants and very knowledgeable owners as well. So you can give them those kinds of parameters, like I'm looking for a native plant that will fit here, that will do this, and they can hook you up with a native plant like that. But honestly, the best nursery is the one that's closest to you, that you're comfortable going to and asking questions to the staff. Staff are always very excited when people ask them those kinds of questions as well, because they're mostly staffed by plant nerds who don't often get the chance to answer these kinds of questions. So a lot of my friends have, their second job is working at Swanson's. So going into Swanson's and asking these kinds of questions, they just get so stoked to be able to use that plant knowledge. So it wasn't much of a great answer, but more of a suggestion of where to go to get it. Oh, milkweed. Milkweed does grow around here. Good to grow, totally. I'm not sure how big the monarch, like we do get monarch butterflies that come through. I don't know how big of a population does move through here, but I don't think there's any challenges growing it. It is a full sun plant, so keep that in mind that it's going to prefer full sun. Oh, Tortuga mound, awesome. Yeah, for good drainage. Yeah, so you can do like different things with how you're putting your yard together to create that drainage as well. I don't think milkweed spreads that much, but it does reseed pretty easily. So it's not going to like spread through underground rhizomes, I don't think, but it does reseed pretty easily. Good question.
All right, well, I think we will wrap up. Thanks for sticking around for a few extra minutes. and for coming and joining us today. This was a wonderful talk, and I hope you all have a wonderful Earth Day tomorrow.
Take care, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, everyone.
Love the heart.